I want you to think back to your very last virtual doctor's appointment. Like, just put yourself right back in that chair staring at your laptop screen.
Oh, yeah. We've all been there.
Right. And did that interaction feel like a seamless, highly calibrated medical evaluation? Or did it feel more like a glitchy video call with a distant relative?
Where half the time you're just going, wait, you're frozen. Can you hear me?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly that.
Well, I mean, for a long time, especially over the last few years, that glitchy video version was just sort of accepted. It was the inevitable standard for virtual healthcare. Patients and providers alike just assumed it was going to be a slightly compromised experience compared to sitting in an actual physical clinic.
Right. But today's deep dive is really about how the industry has moved far beyond that.
Yeah.
Like way past that panicked pandemic era pivot where everyone was just trying to keep the lights on.
Oh, for sure. It's totally different now.
Yeah, so we are looking at the invisible mechanics of modern virtual medicine. Specifically, we've got our hands on an advanced 2026 guide. It's called Telehealth Best Practices for PMHNPs.
And for anyone outside the medical field, PMHNP stands for Psychiatric Mental Health Nurse Practitioners.
Right, thank you. And this text was published by the Psych NP Fellowship and its founder, Lindsay Hill.
Yeah, and the real value of this specific guide, I mean, it pulls back the curtain on how telehealth has evolved into this highly sophisticated delivery model.
It really does.
Like, it operates with its own distinct set of clinical rules, psychological tactics, and even technological requirements that most patients honestly never even notice.
Which is wild. So whether you are a medical professional looking to optimize your digital practice or just a patient wanting to understand what is actually happening while you stare at that little green camera light, this deep dive will reveal the hidden architecture of your screen-based care. Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah, let's get into it.
Because before we even touch the hardware or the software, we really have to understand the human element, right? We have to look at how a practitioner actually conducts a complex psychiatric evaluation when they aren't even in the same room as you.
Right, and that's huge because the cornerstone of psychiatric care is the mental status exam. And historically, that evaluation relied entirely on shared physical space.
Right, sitting across from each other.
Exactly. The practitioner is trained to watch how you walk down the hallway, right? How you sit in the chair, how you hold your physical presence in 3 dimensions. So when you suddenly collapse that entire interaction onto a flat video feed, well, the clinical skills themselves have to be actively adapted for the webcam.
And the source material details how something as fundamental as eye contact is completely altered. I mean, if I look right into your eyes on my monitor, to you, it looks like I'm staring down at my keyboard.
Yeah, it looks like you're totally distracted.
Yeah, right. So practitioners are actually being trained to stop forcing traditional eye contact. Instead, they are taught to observe the patient's eye movement patterns and their attentional focus.
Which is such a subtle shift.
It really is. They're looking at the velocity of how your eyes dart around or, whether you are tracking something off screen.
Yeah, and they're also evaluating psychomotor agitation or retardation, which is essentially just how your physical movements reflect your internal mental state.
Okay, wow.
Yeah, the guide stresses that practitioners must specifically watch for, like subtle hand movements or asymmetrical posture shifts, and even facial microexpressions.
So it's not just looking at the face anymore.
No, not at all. And this transforms camera placement from just, a casual setup into a vital clinical tool. Practitioners have to position their own cameras directly at eye level and make sure they're well lit so patients can clearly read their therapeutic expressions.
But wait, I'm thinking about this. If the practitioner instructs the patient to adjust their camera angle so they can see the upper body,
right?
Say, to catch if the patient is anxiously wringing their hands out of frame, doesn't moving the camera further away mean the doctor is losing the resolution on those facial microexpressions we just talked about?
Oh, totally.
Like you are essentially trading a close-up of the face for a wider shot of the body.
Yes, and that is the exact tension practitioners have to manage right now. You need a wide enough frame to catch the posture, but enough visual clarity to catch a fleeting grimace or maybe a flattening of affect in the eyes.
Man, that sounds incredibly difficult.
It is, which is why the text emphasizes that patients need to be in a well-lit environment. But interestingly, though, the medium actually enhances certain other types of assessment.
Like what?
Well, consider speech. Assessing a patient's speech rate, their volume and rhythm. That's a massive part of a psychiatric diagnosis. And the focused audio channel of a headset actually makes assessing those subtle speech nuances much easier than it might be in a noisy, echoing clinic office.
Oh, I hadn't thought of that.
Yeah.
You have a highly isolated line right into their vocal cadence.
Exactly. No waiting room noise bleeding through the walls.
But I think the part of this section that stands out the most to me is a tactic the guide calls the environmental observation.
Oh, this is wild.
It really is. So the practitioner will ask the patient, assuming they grant permission, obviously, to physically pan their camera around their room.
Right.
And suddenly, the doctor is flooded with clinical data. They can assess the level of environmental clutter, the lighting choices, physical evidence of self-care and neglect, and even the dynamics with family members or roommates sitting in the background.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like looking at someone's open browser tabs. Panning the room gives the practitioner a snapshot of their state of mind that they could never get in a sterile clinic office.
What's fascinating here is how this entirely flips the traditional power dynamic of healthcare.
I'll say more about that.
Well, think about the mechanics of a traditional visit, right?
Yeah.
The patient travels to the doctor's territory. They sit in a waiting room that's designed by some corporation, and they are brought into a clinical space entirely controlled by the medical system.
Yeah, where everything smells like rubbing alcohol.
Exactly. But with the PAN technique, the doctor is stepping into the patient's territory. The patient is hosting the medical professional in their own living space.
Wow, yeah.
And that provides this authentic context for a diagnosis that you simply cannot replicate under those fluorescent clinic lights.
But there is a massive catch to all of this, right? Because panning a camera around a messy bedroom to look for evidence of self-care or trying to read a micro-expression on a patient sitting 3 feet back from their desk.
Yeah.
Well, it's physically impossible if the video feed is a blurry, pixelated mess.
Oh, absolutely.
The need for those visual cues mandates the next major shift in the guide. The tech stack itself is now a clinical tool. Good clinical care in 2026 actually requires specialized hardware.
Right. The days of flipping open a 5-year-old laptop, relying on the built-in pinhole microphone, and just hoping the Wi-Fi holds up, those days are over.
So what are the actual requirements now?
The guide outlines very strict baseline requirements, like built-in laptop cameras are heavily discouraged. A 1080p resolution webcam with strong low-light performance is listed as an absolute clinical necessity.
Just to resolve that tension we mentioned earlier between seeing the body and seeing the face.
Exactly. You have to have those pixels to see both clearly.
And the internet bandwidth requirements are just as specific. The text dictates a baseline of 25 megabits per second download and 10 megabits per second upload.
Yeah, at a bare minimum.
And they strongly advise against Wi-Fi, pushing for a strictly wired Ethernet connection. I have to admit, seeing all these specs, 1080p cameras, dedicated headsets, hardwired internet, are we asking doctors to essentially become Twitch streamers?
It kind of sounds like it, right?
Yeah. I mean, at what point does managing Ethernet cables and lighting rigs distract from actually treating the patient?
Well, let's look at the mechanism of why those internet speeds matter clinically, because technology really is the new stethoscope here.
Close.
If you are on an unstable Wi-Fi connection and the bandwidth drops, you get a micro stutter in the video, right? Or maybe a half-second delay in the audio.
Right, which is super annoying.
It is annoying, but clinically, to a psychiatrist trying to evaluate a patient's cognitive processing speed, that digital stutter could easily be misdiagnosed as an actual cognitive delay.
Oh, wow. I never would have thought of that.
Yeah, or a lag in audio could be misread as thought blocking, which is a symptom where a patient suddenly loses their train of thought. So the technology isn't a distraction from the care, it is the conduit. If the hardware is introducing artifacts, the diagnosis is compromised.
Okay, yeah, that makes perfect sense. That makes the technology a matter of patient safety, not just convenience.
Exactly.
And the guide extends this rigor to the software platforms as well, right?
No, yeah.
Like electronic health record or EHR, integrated video platforms. They mentioned Simple Practice, Therapy Notes, or Valent. Those are highlighted as the most compliant.
Right, they keep everything in one secure place.
But then they also note that standalone platforms like Doxy.me offer a free Hypocata compliant tier, and sometimes that actually provides a smoother user experience for the patient.
Yeah, and regardless of the platform, the guide insists every practitioner must have a backup plan.
Like what? An extra laptop?
Usually a secondary software option, or just having the patient's phone number pulled up so they can instantly switch to an audio-only call if things crash. Because nothing kills clinical credibility faster than tech struggles.
Oh, totally.
I mean, if a patient is trying to work through a severe depressive episode and the practitioner is fumbling with their mute button and freezing on screen, the therapeutic trust just evaporates.
Yeah, it ruins the vulnerability of the moment. But, even if you have the 1080p camera, the wired internet, and flawless software, staring at a high-resolution screen can still feel incredibly isolating.
It definitely can.
Like, a perfect tech stack does not automatically guarantee a perfect human connection. Telehealth has generated this fascinating phenomenon that the guide refers to as the engagement paradox.
And the numbers behind this paradox are very telling. So telehealth boasts much lower no-show rates compared to in-person visits.
Because it's easier, right?
Exactly. Virtual no-shows hover around 10 to 15%, whereas in-person visits sit at like 15 to 25%. The barrier to entry is lower. I mean, opening a laptop is just way easier than commuting across town in traffic.
Right.
However, the text notes that patient dropout rates, meaning patients abandoning the practice entirely after a few sessions, that can actually be higher in telehealth.
Higher dropout rates. That seems so counterintuitive. It's more convenient.
It does, but the psychology behind it makes sense when you consider what you actually lose in a virtual visit. When you go to a physical office, the commute and the waiting room, they act as a psychological buffer zone.
Okay, I see what you mean.
You are preparing your mind to transition from your daily life into a therapeutic space. But when you're at home, you might transition from, paying stressful bills on your laptop directly into processing deep medical trauma on the exact same screen in the exact same chair.
That is heavy.
Yeah. The experience can easily feel impersonal or purely transactional, like ordering a package online.
So how do they fix that? Because to combat that transactional feeling, practitioners are employing highly specific remote rapport building tactics, right?
Yeah, things they would never consciously have to think about if they were sharing physical air.
Like what?
Well, the guide advises practitioners to intentionally dedicate the first 30 to 60 seconds of a virtual visit strictly to warm conversation before touching any clinical data.
Just to humanize it a bit.
Exactly. And they are taught to look directly into the camera lens to simulate eye contact during critical moments of empathy.
So overriding the natural urge to look at the screen.
Right. And they are encouraged to openly acknowledge the awkwardness of the medium right at the start. So saying things like, "We are meeting by video today, so please let me know if the connection feels off at any point."
Just putting it out there. But here's where it gets really interesting. The most effective strategy for patient engagement goes far beyond just polite small talk.
Oh, yeah, the collaboration tools.
Yes. Practitioners are moving away from passive Q&A sessions and utilizing the software's collaboration tools. They are actually sharing their screens to review lab results together in real time.
Which is such a shift from the old clipboard model.
Exactly. They're using virtual whiteboards to physically diagram how a medication works in the brain or to visually plot out a treatment timeline.
And by sharing that screen, the practitioner completely democratizes the medical information.
Yes.
I mean, in a traditional office setup, the doctor is usually holding a clipboard, or maybe they're looking at a monitor that's angled away from you.
Yeah, hiding the chart.
Right. There is this physical and psychological barrier of information. But when a screen is shared, it brings the patient to the exact same side of the virtual desk. They are looking at the raw data together.
It totally transforms the patient from a passive recipient of a diagnosis into an active collaborator in their own treatment plan. It's a brilliant use of the medium to enhance the human connection.
It really empowers the patient.
But while these practitioners are using screen shares to break down information barriers, they are simultaneously walled in by a maze of invisible legal barriers.
Oh boy. Yes. The red tape.
The digital space feels limitless, but the geographical red tape is incredibly rigid.
Yeah, this is really the collision point between legacy healthcare laws and 2026 digital mobility, because the most significant hurdle outlined in the text is state licensure.
Right.
A practitioner must be licensed in the state where the patient is physically located during the exact moment of the visit.
Wait, where the patient is located, not the doctor.
Exactly. It does not matter if the doctor is sitting in their licensed home office. What legally matters is the GPS coordinates of the patient's laptop.
Okay, let's test the mechanics of this with a scenario. Imagine you live in New York, and you have an established long-term relationship with a psychiatrist there. You go on a business trip to California, and while sitting in your hotel room, you experience a severe panic attack. So you open your laptop to have an emergency session with your regular doctor. Technically, according to this guide, Unless your New York doctor also paid for and maintains a medical license in California, they are legally prohibited from treating you while you are in that hotel room.
That is correct.
That is insane. It's like playing three-dimensional chess with zip codes.
Hmm.
Or, it's like trying to plug a European appliance into a U.S. outlet. The internet connection physically works, but the legal current is entirely incompatible without an expensive adapter.
That's a great way to put it. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, you can see how 20th century healthcare regulations are deeply struggling to accommodate modern digital realities.
Clearly.
And the complexity multiplies when you introduce the prescribing of controlled substances. The guide describes this as just a constantly shifting landscape.
So the DEA rules.
Right. The DEA offered numerous flexibilities during the pandemic to allow remote prescribing, but those regulations are subject to continuous review and modification.
So what's the rule right now?
Currently, practitioners can prescribe controlled substances to establish patients via telehealth, but the rules for initial prescriptions, like that very first time you meet a patient virtually, those vary significantly and require intense compliance tracking.
And the regulatory burden doesn't stop at prescriptions either. The text details the intense requirements for telehealth-informed consent and emergency protocols.
Yeah, the crisis management piece is huge.
I mean, if a patient is sitting in a physical clinic and experiences an acute psychiatric emergency, the doctor is right there to manage the physical safety of the room. But on a video call, the doctor might be hundreds of miles away.
Which means before care even begins, the practitioner has to know the patient's exact physical address for that specific session.
So no logging in from a random coffee shop without telling them.
Exactly. They have to pre-locate the patient's nearest physical emergency room. They need to have local crisis hotline numbers specific to the patient's current zip code.
Wow.
And they must know the granular state requirements for initiating remote emergency involuntary holds, which, by the way, vary wildly across state lines.
So regulatory compliance and crisis management logistics are now just as crucial as clinical diagnostic knowledge.
Basically, yes.
I mean, a practitioner could be the most brilliant diagnostician in the country, but if they don't know the emergency dispatch protocols for the county their patient is logging in from, they cannot safely practice virtual medicine.
Absolutely.
And because of this intense legal friction and the reality that some medical assessments simply require physical touch or, 3D spatial observation, the guide arrives at a very grounded conclusion.
It does.
The future of psychiatric care in 2026 is not a 100% remote utopia. The sustainable future is strategic hybridity.
Yeah, it is entirely about utilizing the correct modality for the specific clinical need. The guide breaks down the optimal use cases pretty clearly.
So when is telehealth actually the best option?
Telehealth is highly ideal for medication management follow-ups, checking in on stable patients who are on maintenance regimens, providing access to individuals with transportation barriers, and conducting quick initial consultations just to determine if the provider and patient are a good therapeutic fit.
Okay, but the guide insists that in-person care remains essential for other scenarios, like comprehensive new patient evaluations often require the doctor to have that unfiltered physical observation to establish a baseline.
Right, you need the whole picture.
And acute crises require physical presence for safety. Plus, any situation requiring physical exam components demands an office visit. And frankly, some patients simply respond better to physical presence. They just need to sit in a room with another human being to feel grounded.
Yeah, and to manage these two very different modes of care, the most successful practices utilize a business strategy called batching. Yeah, so rather than doing a virtual visit, then walking down the hall to see a patient in person, and then running back to a webcam for the next one, practitioners are scheduling their weeks into dedicated blocks.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
Right. They might do 2 to 3 days of strictly telehealth and then 1 to 2 days of strictly in-person visits per week.
So what does this all mean? The guide explains that this batching method reduces the cognitive switching cost for the practitioner.
Exactly.
Because we've talked about how different the clinical skills are across these mediums. Expecting a doctor's brain to seamlessly flip back and forth between parsing 2D digital cues on a monitor and managing the 3D spatial awareness of a physical clinic room every 45 minutes, that would lead to massive clinical exhaustion.
Oh, total burnout. Batching allows them to optimize their workspace and their headspace for each specific type of evaluation.
It's just a smarter way to work.
It is. And, this raises an important question for you, the listener. Knowing how the mental status exam is actively altered on a screen, and knowing the strict hardware requirements and understanding the psychology behind the engagement paradox. What stands out to you?
That's a great question.
When you evaluate your own healthcare preferences, do you prefer the specialized convenience and the environmental context of the webcam? Or do you still crave the traditional reassurance of sitting in the exact same room as your provider?
It is a totally personal calculation that every patient has to make, and it's fascinating to see the industry actively adapting to support both. We've covered a massive amount of ground today.
We really have.
We trace the journey from doctors learning to read your executive function by panning a webcam around your messy bedroom, all the way to the strict clinical necessity of 1080p cameras and hardwired Ethernet. We navigated the invisible legal borders of state licensure and DEA regulations and explored how balancing the physical and digital worlds through hybrid batching is the only way to create a sustainable practice.
Yet, the landscape is preparing to shift again. There is this deeply significant detail buried near the end of the source material that hints at the next massive evolution.
I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, the text mentions the APRN Compact, which is legislation that would allow for multi-state licensing for these specific practitioners. And according to the guide, this compact is just 2 states away from officially activating.
Just 2 states. So if that compact activates and multi-state licensing becomes a widespread reality, will the concept of a local community doctor eventually disappear entirely?
It's a huge shift to consider.
I mean, if those invisible legal borders are erased and telehealth is fully matured and reimbursed equally by insurance, your primary psychiatrist could soon be sitting thousands of miles away. You might choose them purely for their highly specific niche expertise rather than their geographic proximity to your neighborhood. How does that change the fundamental fabric of community health?
It would completely redraw the map of who treats whom, shifting the entire foundation of healthcare from geography to pure specialization.
It's mind-blowing. So the next time you log on for a virtual appointment, remember the invisible mechanics at play. It is no longer just a glitchy video call. It is a highly calibrated, heavily regulated, psychologically complex medical environment happening right there on your laptop.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the architecture of your virtual care. Keep asking questions, keep looking for those hidden connections, and we'll see you next time.